You're tuned in to RX Radio.
Welcome back, guys. Another episode of RX Radio. This week, we break down the intricacies and differences of core training and bracing. Jay and I sort of go through a step-by-step process of how it is we can transfer someone from an initial core training into more advanced dynamic bracing and really getting into the weeds as far as how they're different, how they're the same, when they should be different, and when they should be the same. So I think a conversation that often just gets glossed over and not understanding how these words are interpreted at the level of our clients really leads to some less than desirable training outcomes. So a great episode where Jay and I sort of just have this conversation and stumble into a very workable model, kind of dissecting how our brains logic these two big parts of training. And some would argue, especially in the rehab space, some of the biggest, most fundamental parts of training are core training and bracing. So do enjoy the episode, guys. Real quick, huge shout out to everyone who's joined the collective. If you haven't, in the next coming weeks, my training is actually going to be a part of the collective. So Killian's going to be coaching me, putting up all the reps and sets and the exercises and all that. So my full exercise programming is going to be made available on Prescript Collective. I'm going to be posting a lot of the videos of my training, and we can discuss exercise execution, exercise order. If you don't have some of the machines that I have, we'll talk about how it is we can make logical substitutions for some of the machines that I might have access to that you might not, or vice versa, or potentially better solutions for machines that you might have. Really get down to the ones and zeros and the intent of exercise programming through the vehicle of my own training. So big reason that we're going to be looking at doing this is I need to make sure that I'm in shape for when I go to the UK. So when you guys, hopefully if you're in the UK, Rotherham, Bolton, Manchester area, we're going to be having a lower body intensive at Strength Factory, which is going to be early April. And the weekend prior to that, we're going to do a hypertrophy intensive at the Ultraflex in Rotherham, which is going to be the last weekend of March. I got to say, I'm excited for both, but the lower intensive has so many light bulb moments, so many aha moments that if you're a coach, if you're someone who's looking to make a living or a career out of doing this, understanding the nuances and creating a workable model of how it is that we're going to make decisions around lower body training, progressions, regressions, adaptations, optimizations, lower intensive Strength Factory. That's going to be the one for you. Payment plans are available on the website, www.pre-script.com. So do make sure you grab your tickets before they're gone. It's going to be the last weekend of March. So all that to say, guys, today's episode, core training and bracing. If you like it, share it. If you listen to the podcast, hit subscribe. We've had, a great start to the year on the podcast side of things. Want to keep it going so we can keep bringing you guys more episodes. Subscribe to iTunes, Spotify, as well as YouTube. If you have any questions or anything, just leave in the comment section, YouTube, or just DM us at RX Radio on Instagram. If for no further ado, we'll see you guys next week.
So do you remember your first personal training client?
Good question. You are on it today.
I'm on it, man.
Personal training client. Yes, I do.
How old were you?
JP.
Paint the scenario for me.
His name was JP. I was 16.
Okay.
Maybe 17 years old.
Okay.
I want to say his name was Jean-Pierre Landry, I think was his name. I still don't get to this day. If I go into my Google Calendar, I hand to fucking God. Oh my God, please don't die. I'm fairly certain I still have his Google Calendar linked to mine. I'm pretty sure if I go into my other email address, I'm going to actually try this. So yes, I do remember it. His name was, I'm pretty sure it was JP Landry.
That's like 15 years ago, dude. That was like cutting edge technology.
It was, I was ahead of my time. Yep. I was an innovator. I was like Lewis and Clark.
As you are.
Yeah, JP Landry. I can't find it, but I'm pretty sure I still send him a message on his mom's birthday because it's literally the only thing in his calendar for the whole. He probably doesn't use the email address anymore. It was weird because I felt I knew as much about training as he did. But that's kind of the hard part is you don't know how little people know about exercise. It's phenomenal to me. Because so much of that dictates my decision-making process on a day-to-day basis. Am I going to do this today? Well, what am I training? How does that going to affect my training? Am I going to eat this today? Am I going to eat this now? You know, like, shit, what did I eat last night? All right, maybe I'm going to fucking pull that out of breakfast tomorrow. Like, and so I don't know. Like, to me, I literally couldn't live without knowing what I know about exercise. So my immediate response is, well, if this person is here and alive, they must know these things that I deem to be essential to my life. And I've thought that I've had that like insecurity or that lack of awareness for 15 years.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think the same way too is like this stuff is, I mean, obviously you and I have immersed ourselves in this stuff since the day we touched our first dumbbell or barbell or whatever. But it still blows my mind that people don't know how to use their body. Or like I try and like, you know, lay things out and I think it's like simple stuff and people just don't understand it. I was laughing about that question because I remember my first personal training client. I was probably like, I was a little older. I was like 18 or 19, I think. And this is my first like paying client. This person was paying me. And I'm like, dude, at that age, you're fucking invincible and you know everything. Like, I kind of outgrew that. It's more situational now, but
it's basically, could I fuck this guy up? All right, then I know everything.
Exactly. I'm king of the fucking world.
Right.
It was one of my good friends' girlfriends. He's like, hey, she wants to get into weight training. Can you train her? And it was like right after I got my first personal training certification, all this stuff. I'm like, fuck yeah, I can do that. So I just like took her through the workouts that I do. And this poor girl, like, probably got wrapped up. She probably got fucking wrapped up. She was fucked up for, like, 2 weeks. And then she paid me, like, $30, I remember. That was my fee back then. And then she came back, like, 2 weeks later. And we did, like, a different body part. Fucked her up for, like, 2 weeks again. Never saw her again. She may have died after that.
You know who the GOAT in this story is? The guy who was smart enough to get someone else to train his girl. That guy, your boy is like a hedge fund manager right now. Like that is,
absolutely.
You know how long that took me to learn?
Oh man,
like,
Chris Kelly,
no, this one will be different. Haha, just kidding. She hates me now. Like,
oh my god,
oh man, shout out that guy. Yeah, it's hard because and there's people who get fixated on weird parts of fitness. That'll like, I've had this experience of they'll see something on 60 Minutes and then they'll come in and be like, be an expert on something you've never heard of, and you're like, oh fuck. All right, here's the whistle and the clipboard. You train me. I don't know anything anymore. Yeah. But then it is pretty like the proving ground is always like how people move, right? Because I always have it where it's like I'll start with someone, and I can appraise other personal trainers and other coaches' skill based off of their body of work, which is how their clients move. Like I've had some clients come in and it's just like, oh shit, okay, who have you worked with in the past? They're like, oh yeah, you can move. Where other people like, oh yeah, I've had a personal trainer for blah 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 blah, like X number of years, and then they move and you're like, well, you might as well have been doing nothing for the last 5 years, 10 years, whatever. It's so draining your first couple sessions trying to figure out, like, some people are great squatters naturally, right? But you put them in a different movement or a different plane and they just completely crumble. So you're always looking for signals that help fill in the gaps or like illuminate your thought processes. Like I can take a bicep curl with most people, and with that weight that they use in a bicep curl, extrapolate out to different upper body movements of where to start. It's like I can walk up to a lat pull down and just be like, okay, this person like struggles with 15-pound dumbbells. They're this body weight. And I just take the pin and I just put it somewhere perfectly. Yeah. And then I go, okay, what was that? And then I have an allotted rep and set scheme. And then at the end, I just write down the weight because it was a perfect weight. And I'm basing that information off of like an algorithm of like, well, they lateral raise this, they dumbbell flat press this, they bicep curl this, they tricep extension this, they're this body weight and this rough body fat percentage. This is your lat pull down weight.
Yeah.
Right?
It's proportions, right?
Yeah, it should be. But calibrating all that information, because once I have it written in the book, like it's kind of like, then it's easy. It's like, well, we did 135 for 8 whatever reps last week. But arriving at that initial number, like your first couple of sessions with a new client it's so much data processing, right? It's basically like it is collecting it's just collecting data, right? Visual motor feedback, sensory motor feedback. Like, I feel this in my quad. It's like, this is a chest press. Why do you feel that in your quad? I feel this here. So it's like so much data collection, and then like the programming starts. So like the first two, yeah, I would do this purposely, like in practice. I used to try and fill up my initial visits on a particular day, and I just couldn't do it, man. Like, I would do initials for like 5 or 6 hours. So I'd have 5 or 6 new patients on a single day, and I could do 10 hours of follow-ups. Fine, go to the gym, no problem. But 5 hours of initials, you're just like everything. Like, you're looking at eye contact, just movement, orthopedic evaluations. You're like, okay, is this painful? Is this painful? When does the pain start in this range of motion? Where it's like establishing a baseline of movement competency in an individual has to be one of the most complex processes that someone can go through. Like, what are they good at? What are they bad at? Where is the pain? What is their strength? What are their weaknesses? What are their instabilities? Where is their awareness? What are their aversions? What are their skills? Like, and you need to just sit there and just watch, and your brain is just fucking on overdrive. There's so much to collect.
Yeah. It's like you're getting into a fist fight in a dark room, and then they flip the lights on, and every time it's like a different number of people that you're fighting.
Yeah.
That's what it feels
There's
like.
a ghost in a machine.
Exactly, dude. And one of the things that I find really valuable in assessing these people is their subjective experience level, right? It's sponsored by.
Quick plug.
And weighing their subjective experience level against how they actually move, the more objective things, or what I apply as the objective things to them. So that if there's a big distance there, then like, okay, fuck, we're in for a long road of progression with this person. Yeah. But if it's someone that's maybe a little bit hesitant, like, I've been doing this a while, but I'm not that great, I'm not that strong, and you see the move and it's like a work of art, like, all right, this is going to be fun.
Yeah. Because it is just learning, right? Like, I think that was when this processing of like becoming good, good is obviously, I'm probably still terrible, but like, at least I'm efficient. I get there, I get to a terrible place very quickly. And then I go, okay, let's go to a different place that hopefully is less terrible. But the efficiency comes in looking at the process, not of like, I'm trying to get this client big, I'm trying to get this client lean, I'm trying to get this client fast. It's like, I need this client to learn this. I need them to learn to be strong. I need to learn to be fast. I need them to learn how to lose weight. That for me was like, it almost condensed all of the available information that a client gives you, both verbally and non-verbally, to like, it sifts through a bunch of noise and just gives you signal. It's like, okay, what is the useful things out of this onslaught of getting punched in the dark? What are these ones that I actually need to pay attention to, and where do we need to focus our resources, whether it be time, money, energy, whatever, to learning the process to achieve like the goal? And once I looked at it that way, it became way less overwhelming, because I remember being like so overwhelmed. For some reason, between every exercise, I turned into like a guy who worked a NASCAR pit crew. Like, if I wasn't good, at least I was really good at switching handles out on cables machines. Like, dude, I was like fucking 3 seconds and we're on from a bicep curl to a tricep extension. I was like, I need to show some effort, because I probably sound retarded with 90% of the stuff I'm actually saying. So I need to look good. So I need to be able to like clip things in and clip things out really quick. But the second I was like, oh, they just need to learn how to be strong, and then look at it as a process of just acquiring new skills, rather than like this weird nebulous thing that people will never really achieve, but they're always going to chase. It was like, it made life so much easier, because there are things that, like, there are challenges with people that are inevitably be present. Like, I think one of the issues, like from a learning perspective, and the things that I got really good at teaching, was bracing. Undoubtedly, if you had someone who was going to a personal trainer, one of their issues that they probably needed to consistently work on, almost regardless of skill level, is bracing. I feel like that's a huge divide. People who train themselves and feel confident with training versus those who feel like a coach would probably be a better asset to their training. I think that difference really lies in their ability and their confidence in their ability to brace their spine.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of like the lowest common denominator to all of this stuff. If there's going to be one thing that's going to break down, it's going to be the core in whatever movement it might be. So it's interesting for me to see people that have gotten further down that athletic progression without really understanding core bracing. Because you'll never be a great athlete if you don't understand how to use your core. But you can get pretty far into the intermediate. You can be stronger than some people, stronger than maybe, I don't know about most, but in a general setting, you can be stronger than a lot of people or do things that, I won't say better either, but at a higher level of performance than other people without really understanding how to use your core. And I think that's when it becomes the most dangerous. That's when you see the weekend warriors or the people that herniated, L345, doing a deadlift or whatever it is, because they don't really grasp the concept of how to use their core to transfer force. So, and it's not very intuitive. It's something that, I still struggle with on some days in certain scenarios. So it's something that it takes a lot of awareness and it takes a lot of restraint to be able to really control your core and learn how to control your core and apply that to different scenarios. So I think that's why a lot of people go so far into their, I'm going to put the athletic in air quotes here, into their athletic career without actually properly learning, because if you don't have a foundation that's built around core bracing or properly using your core in, a barbell lift or, even like sprinting or running or directional changes, things like that, how to properly use your core to be able to transfer momentum and transfer force, then it's not something that's very intuitive and you can get away without doing it to a degree.
Right. Yeah, I think equally as bad as people are at creating awareness, it's equally poor, or people are equally poor at teaching it, right?
Absolutely,
like,
yeah.
If I look at a class, or if I'm looking at a school that has poor performance in the classroom, like I'm some sort of government agency looking at test scores across the province or across the state, and I'm looking at like math scores in a particular school, I'm not thinking, God, these guys are bad at math. I'm thinking, who the fuck is the math teacher in this place? And that's
so true.
and I think one of the biggest issues is that core bracing is been too remedial, like from an education perspective. Like most people's regressive models of teaching core bracing usually start with something like the big three. Have you heard this thing that Stu McGill's been on some, I don't want to say rampage, but telling people that they deserve their pain? Have you heard about this? Dude, Grandpa, I think it's time to retire.
I kind of like it.
Dude,
we need that guy out there, man. But I'm not going to be that guy.
Right. You jump on that grenade. I think it's time to retire. But like, what a weird sentiment of fear mongering. Like, if I don't do a bird dog, I deserve to have low back pain. And like, I could be paraphrasing. This like came to my attention the other day. And I've been jokingly using it in context, or I've been jokingly using it out of context. Like, someone posted a video of like, the elf on the shelf. And it was like a chiro who was like, oh, did you have low back pain? And like the elf fell off the shelf, and it was sort of like a play on the seasonal theme of the elf on the shelf. I'm like, that elf deserved his pain. It was just like,
fuck that guy.
Right. But it is kind of, but I think a lot of people, if we're struggling with spinal bracing at the level of, general population, or at least the general population that find themselves into gyms or fitness centers or whatever, it's not their fault. Right? It's the teacher's fault. And I think the teachers, a lot of times, like our teachers in high school, what do? They taught from the textbook. Well, who wrote the textbook on like low back pain and bracing? It was a guy who said if you laid on the floor and bent one of your knees, then you wouldn't hurt yourself deadlifting a bunch of weight. And it's like, I think the model behind spinal bracing, conventionally, is broken. Right? I think it's a broken way of teaching it. I don't think it actually takes into effect like the specificity that position puts on how a brace should be applied. Right? I think bracing a lot of times just gets tangled up with static, gets tangled up with immobility. Like do you remember Paul Braun? Do you remember that guy from Chiro School? Yeah. Big hair, like good dude, good shape, like golf fit. Like this guy probably sails on weekends, like one of those kind of dudes.
Yeah.
But like I remember
two-dimensional. Like if you see him from the side, he's not really there. Yeah.
He's not really there. That's a great way to look at it. And I remember playing pool with you and watching this guy like get something out of the fridge in the break room in grad school, and like very robotic, like never twisted, just stayed like literally like in my head I was doing the sound effects of like how he opened the door like a robot, like and he would just do like this robot, and he was so focused on like spinal bracing. I was like, bracing doesn't mean like, I think when people hear bracing they're like, oh yeah, like Forrest Gump's legs, right? Like that kind of bracing. It's like no, like bracing is a dynamic phenomenon, not a static phenomenon. And I think that's where the spinal bracing immediately goes off the rails, and we end up down like doing bird dogs are the stupidest exercise on the entire planet. They are so dumb. If anything, the only thing the bird dog proves is how pervasive science can be in practice. That if the guy doing research on pig spines it can prove it, then people are like, I don't know, I guess this. It's like, are you fucking joking me? Because again, it's static. It's like, can your spine not move as rotation occurs? It's like, when that disc herniation's gonna occur? When the rotation is happening with movement, right? Can you brace with movement? Can it be a dynamic phenomenon? And I think a lot of times when it comes to explaining the brace, a lot of people at the entry level default to, bird dog curl up side plank. Do some breathing stuff, do some like alligator breathing, do a dead bug. And it's like, no. Like the second you pull that position away from him, that pattern of bracing goes away, right? Like if I have a bar on my back and I'm not lying on my back, then the thing I use lying on my back, that skill that I learned to stabilizing my spine with the floor underneath me it's a different game. It's literally a different game. It's like learning how to swing a baseball bat and then putting a golf club in your hand and being like, yeah, it's kind of the same. Just the ball's down there and it's not coming at you, and it's just like a Titleist now. And you're like, well, I have a Louisville Slugger. It's like, this isn't going to work. It's the same thing. To think the transferability of static to dynamic is probably one of the biggest leaps in biomechanics.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And kind of to parallel that, one of my favorite things is when people ask, like, when are we going to do core work? And keep in mind, I primarily coach weightlifting, right? So if you're weightlifting, if you're snatching, you're cleaning, you're jerking, you're squatting, front squatting, lunging, whatever it might be, everything that you're doing is core work. Your core is the linchpin between your lower body, your leg drive, and that bar in your hands. So like sometimes, I guess in this scenario, it falls on me, right? That's lack of communication. But the idea that core work is this specific thing that needs to be separate from your compound lifts or whatever you're doing in your specific exercises. And if, we'll say, I was actually asked this last week, and the accessory work that day was dumbbell rows. So bent over dumbbell rows, and what was it? Staggered stance Romanian deadlifts. So, someone a little more exposed might say, okay, I understand what you're doing here. In a single arm dumbbell row, what we're doing is we're bracing the core, we're moving the scapula, we're engaging the lats. In the job of the core in this position is to resist rotation and flexion at the trunk. Okay, that's core work, right? Am I wrong there? Is that right? That's core work. Yeah. Right. And then, very similar demand on the core with a staggered stance deadlift, right? Is you're controlling movement through the hips, you're resisting excessive flexion through the trunk, any rotation through the trunk, that's core work. But that's dynamic core work. And I think a lot of times people think that, core work is I'm going to work my abs, I'm going to get my six pack, I'm going to do my, I don't know, what do people do for core work? This is probably like you see in pure muscle fitness more than I see around here. What is a ab day? Leg
raises.
Okay,
and
that's a good one.
And you bring up a really interesting point, because I think it's worth highlighting that what you've said out of the gate was like really important. I don't want people to gloss over it. Is you teach Olympic weightlifters. So if you understand center of mass and understand deviation of center of mass, when a barbell is over your head and that bar is heavy, the amount that your core has to work in order to keep that aligned over your midfoot or your combined center of mass of the weight of the bar and obviously like your own proportions of your body is exponentially further. And that exponent is set to the distance of the bar away from the midline, right? So because you are having people in very, let's call it non-forgiving positions, right? A snatch is a very non-forgiving position. A top of a clean and jerk is a very non-forgiving position in the sense that if you are not within a few degrees or a few millimeters of your combined center of mass being centered over your midfoot, you're going to lose the lift, right? So the core is tested way more when the distance from your center of mass is greater, right? So like if I think to contrast, what is the purpose in powerlifting? Well, the powerlifting is like really maximizing leverages where there's not this like hard and fast, like the bar has to be here on your back and no further. The bar has to be this high. It's like, if you want to roll the dice, you can basically do a deadlift with the bar on your spine and call it a squat. And some people do that, right? But it's like the demand for core work when the bar is like, I don't know, 8 inches away from your center of mass versus the demand for core work when the bar that you're consistently training with over 90% is 5 feet away from your combined center of mass. Right. There's a different demand underlying the core, which would, in the pursuit of balancing a training program, dictate who in which position should be loading the core work directly or who it might benefit from direct core work. So like obviously a power lifter I think could benefit from direct core work. If you're squatting low bar, you're benching on a bench where your spine is supported and likely arched, and you're deadlifting where you're probably using more of your lats per se, and lats obviously depends on your definition of core, but in as far as like transverse abdominis, rectus, internal, external, and you're wearing a big fucking 13 millimeter belt that's 4 inches around your entire torso. So, because that's always the divide. And like, I just hate when arguments don't get contextualized like that. Right. Like, I think there is absolutely a place for direct core work in the majority of exercise programs. I think if you are indoctrinated into an Olympic lifting style of programming or CrossFit or something that has more unforgiving movements that are rate limited at the spine, as you learn that, you'll develop the requisite core work, and it'll be as difficult as any isolated core work that you can do. But so, I think
I'm sorry to interrupt, but to provide further context, you're using the word direct core work versus indirect core work. Can you just define those for, myself and anyone listening to?
Right. So indirect would be, like, I would call the row as indirect. Because like the direct single arm dumbbell row would be like a lat, maybe rhomboid rear delt as like the primary with an underlying secondary. And who knows, if that row breaks down at the level of the core, then it's maybe a little bit more direct. But I would say something that the primary goal is for the stimulus to be directed at the transverse abdominis, rectus abdominis, internal and external oblique. Right, where it's like there's no other involvement, no extraneous, use of resources at a lat, at a hamstring or a glute, like in the single leg or B stance RDL that you talked about as well. So like I'm thinking, because I see the need for clarification because direct and indirect is not the same as static and dynamic core work, right? So like bird dog side plank curl up, probably more on the static direct core work, where like rope crunch, Russian twist, these things are more on the direct dynamic core work, right? Because I think there's absolutely an ability, because, as those two things subdivide, and you bring up a really good point of distinction where it's like, okay, here's an integrated approach, here's an isolated approach. The isolated breaks down into static and dynamic. I think when we look through most people, and I would honestly say it's most people in fitness that are trying to be like woke, myth-busting fitness on the gram, they go like, there was a cohort of like powerlifters primarily, like, you don't need to do extra core work. My core work is squat, bench, and dead. I'm like, the bar is 6 inches from your fucking belly button. You're deadlifting primarily with your lats and your spine is laying on a bench. Shut the fuck up and do an ab wheel, right? And then there's like this other cohort that goes, no, you should do direct core work. You should do side plank, bird dog, and curl up. It's like, I really think the answer for most people, a lot of the times in the general fitness space, is like, you should probably actually start with direct dynamic core work. Like, teach the spine to go through flexion extension. Teach the spine to go through controlled bouts of lateral flexion and rotation, right? Try and control and find the outer limits of these ranges of motion through the spine in a controlled environment. Because it's like, you want to talk specificity, because you brought up like the weekend warrior that like herniates a disc. It's like, well, yeah, this guy goes and plays flag football on the weekend. It's like that spine is going to be loaded in a dynamic fashion. That rotation is going to be happening as insertion moves away from origin, right? Those ribs are going to rotate away from the pelvis, and the obliques are just going to be, it's like, wait, these obliques don't know how to work when the rib cage isn't stacked atop the pelvis. What are you going to do when the rib cage is facing one side of the field and the pelvis is facing the other side of the field, right? So I think it's something where we kind of try and get too cute with it. Right?
Yeah.
And that's something that nerds do. Don't get cute.
Yeah. I think we just indirectly build a hierarchy here, right? Like the hierarchy of core work or core training, right? It would start with a more direct static. Maybe then you progress towards direct, what was it, dynamic or integrated that you used? And then it would be
Dynamic,
indirect static, and then indirect dynamic, right?
Boom.
So yeah, exactly.
Totally.
So that's like
The last
McGill over
podcast
here,
on
and then
core
like all the way to the range of like sport,
McGill right here.
sport McGill right here,
Right.
and then sport training right here, buddy.
Yeah, and here's the thing: meet people where they're at on the hierarchy. I
Absolutely,
would say most people, you know, like, especially, it depends on your demographic. Look, you got a geriatric guy coming in, hasn't fucking, you know, is afraid to go out in the winter because the old slip and fall. Like, do you give the guy his money back and you get him a life alert, or do you just try and train him? It's like, maybe this guy starts direct static. Right? But, you know, if you got someone like me or you comes in, played a bit of sports, lifts a bit of weights, it's like, if we need to regress to direct static because we're seeing issues in performing and technique at direct dynamic, sure. Right? But then I'm going to start to push you through this, probably concurrently train you through direct, because it's inadvertent. It's going to happen. The indirect static stuff, like the single arm row, is probably going to just happen as a consequence of programming. A single arm dumbbell row is probably going to be in someone's programming. But the trick is, I need to retroactively recognize that exercise has a primary goal, which might be targeting the lats or rhomboids or whatever, but also has a secondary effect that would then alter the performance of other core work from a fatigue factor, right? Like, if I did a single arm dumbbell row on a machine versus a single arm machine row versus a single arm dumbbell row, I'm like equating for that second slot, right? Going like, do I need more additional core work at the level of dynamic static or integrated static? Or integrated static, in the sense that integrated static would be like a single arm dumbbell row. If the answer is no, this person's getting a lot of core work across the hierarchy, it's like, well, maybe I just drive the output of the lat devoid of the contribution of any indirect core work having to stabilize that exercise, right? So you have to keep an active inventory of what's being asked to stabilize the spine. Because if you fatigue that and you find yourself in these positions and there's a latency, that's where you start to run into some problems, right? I always tell this story of before I took over strength as the strength coach at Stanford Rugby, there was a lot of non-contact ACLs the season before. And one of the things that I directly attributed it when retroactively looking at the programming was that the day before the game, they were all doing like isometric and or active like Nordic hamstring curls. So there was such a fatigue and latency in the hamstring, which should support in resisting anterior tibial translation, that as they were changing directions on the field and those hamstrings like semimembranosus and semitendinosus medially and bicep femoris laterally, which should be there to keep the tibia adjacent to the femur, if there was a latency onset from fatigue, well, guess what? If the hamstring is not there, that split second, that tibia and the femur are malaligned, the ACL is now asked to resist that force, to which it can't. So it's like, yeah, probably don't make their fucking hamstrings exhausted the day before they do a bunch of change of direction shit on the field. And I was like, you know, knock on wood, we had the whole season with no ACL issues. And like, I logically attribute that. And there's like larger factors of like overall fatigue management that come into play, but that kind of same question exists when you're talking about concurrent training around the spine. It's like, look, if this person's deadlifting the next day and you're doing some back stuff today, I want to make sure all of the back stuff that we're doing is as externally stabilized as possible, so that we're not tapping into a reserve of things that intrinsically stabilize the spine, right? Whether that is intrinsically in the sense of like rectus abdominis transverse, internal and external oblique, or deeper so multifidus, intertransverse area, and erectors, right? So it is something that from a muscular perspective has to be taken into consideration. And I really like that breakdown of like, okay, we have integrated and isolated, let's say, and we have static and dynamic, and going through like an isolated static, isolated dynamic, integrated static, integrated dynamic. So to fill that in for people, an isolated static, big three movements, an isolated dynamic, something like a rope crunch or I don't know, a Russian twist, something like that, where you're moving from insertion to origin. Then you start to work out into the appendages with an integrated static single arm dumbbell row, where like that rib cage is staying static as the appendage sort of moves, or as that arm sort of moves, to integrated dynamic. That would be something like a med ball throw or something like that, where the rib cage is dissociating with the pelvis, and then we're creating this rotation through the spine while still directly exerting force rather than resisting force. I think we did it.
I think this
is the last core training. You know what this is? We should just the last core training podcast. That's it. That's the fucking. These are expensive mics. I don't want to drop these, but like that's a mic drop. I really don't think there's another way to organize core training. Yeah. And of course, you heard it here first on RX Radio.
That's it. We are the smartest on the internet.
Dude, if the Spotify 2021 listening hours, which shout out you guys.
Yeah, fuck, you guys are awesome.
Who was the winner? Who took home? I saw like 15, who was it? Had 9 days worth of minutes listen.
Yeah, I'll look it up right now. I think I have it on my Instagram.
Do you have it? Unbelievable. That'll be if anyone could beat that next year,
it was like 9 days and some change. It was fucking wild.
24
Evan Childs, that's who it was.
Evan Childs. Oh, fucking right.
Yeah,
that's
1036 Kinetics on Instagram.
That's a lot of, shouts out 10. We got to shout him out on the next like 10 pods because that's a lot of minutes. Lundy, can you crunch the numbers on how many minutes that is total?
It was like 13. It was like 13,000 and like, it was 15,000?
I think it was 15.
Jesus, fuck.
Just under 13,000. I can't. I'm out. I'd be out. I think if I had my voice in my head that often, I'd kill myself. I think I'd be done. I'd be out the game for sure.
I think I blocked RX Radio on Spotify.
Just unsubscribed? I'm like, why? Wait a minute. Someone in San Jose, California, I'm not going to give your address, but just unsubscribe to the podcast. But no, I think that's a very logical way of looking at core training. But the only thing is, core training and bracing are two different things. Right. And because I think we've just cracked the code on the muscular component of core bracing, and there's a respiratory component to core bracing as well. And that's where I think a lot of people, because just as most people might, or some people might look at core training and be like, oh yeah, it's just training abs. Yeah. Or sorry, core bracing and saying it's just training abs. There's just as many people who think core bracing is just breathing. Big deep breath in.
Yeah.
Go.
So tell me your thoughts on over breathing. Have you ever heard someone use that term, like in a lift? No, you haven't.
Okay, so hold on. I hate the words, but as I think about it, I can maybe understand it. But I might be giving someone too much credit. Do explain.
Let me play out the scenario. So the way I've heard it, the context around this would be someone setting up. Well, I'll use a clean and jerk as an example here because that's an easy one for me in my world. And they put too much weight into the breathing component as opposed to the muscular component of the bracing. So they're over breathing more than they should, expanding that thoracic cavity, that lowering that diaphragm, probably more than they can, more than is necessary to create the proper muscular brace.
Right. So it just comes down to position. Right? Like ultimately, I hear over breathing and I just hear someone's in a bad position because I see people over breathe in a back squat all the time. Right? For example, like if you ever see a bar jump off someone's back as they breathe, it's like, and their upper posterior rib cage elevates and you see the bar elevate. It's like, that's probably over breathing you're not going to
guilty of
die
that.
from too much oxygenation, but you're just in a bad position to start the lift. Right. Although I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt, because having that bar bounce on your back is probably really sport specific to how you catch squats in the hole. So if that bar is bending when you hit the hole, I think it's like, well, it's probably not that big of a deal, because it's like, it's probably going to be bouncing anyways. And you lift on bars that are meant to be a little bit more,
they oscillate
forgiving.
more. Yeah.
Right. So I don't think that's the end of the world. But when people inhale and they hyperextend, it's like, is it the breathing or is it just a lack of awareness? Because I can fucking breathe a lot and still keep a good position. Like,
I see what you're saying.
I can exhale for minutes. Like, I'll literally, at the end of a long day, if I'm fucking stressed, and that's been a lot this year, we were comparing wrinkles in our foreheads earlier today. We were literally like holding the camera up and just being like, you think those are bad?
This is
This is like the Nile River. Like, this is ridiculous. This is like icebergs, glaciers created these. Oh my God. But, yeah, I just think like I can breathe a lot and stay in a good position because it's a skill that I've practiced. Right?
Absolutely.
Like I can, in a position, to contract my diaphragm with my rib cage adjacent to my pelvis in a particular position. So I think over breathing is just a way to, I don't want to say blame, but I think it's a coach's way of blaming a lack of poor positioning on something. And I think you should be able to maintain that position with musculature. And because that's always how I look at bracing. Like, I think of bracing and I always talk about Boyle's law. So Boyle's law is the relationship of pressure and volume in a closed temperature system, which is like, why am I listening to this podcast anymore? So I always think of it this way. Imagine your intra-abdominal cavity like a box, right? So you have like this box and it has a lid, and we open the lid and then we put a balloon in. And this is going to be like the pressure that's caused by the lowering of the diaphragm. Now, the one thing that I think really screws people up from a bracing perspective, and has for 20 years, 50 years, I don't know, it's been at least been fucking people up since I've been in the industry, is the idea of breathing into your stomach. Problem number one with breathing into your stomach: you don't have lungs in your stomach, right? So you create a increase in like fluid pressure based off of the fact that the diaphragm begins to make the box smaller. Right? It smushes the top of the box down. Now, you have a certain amount of space inside that box for the balloon to fit. Now, if you take a big breath in and you end up in this over breathing position, right? The rib cage is flared up, the pelvis is dumped forward. It's like, well, what have you done? It's like, yeah, you filled up the balloon as the diaphragm lowers and makes this greater amount of pressure, but you've also expanded the room in the box. So the amount of pressure is the same. It's a net wash, because it's like, if I breathe in and my ribs come up, my pelvis anteriorly tilts, it's like, okay, that's great. We have a bigger balloon in a bigger box, and then increase of, bracing pressure on the spine is zero. The trick is, how can you put a big balloon in a small box, right? So some people can end up in an over-inhaled position by filling up that balloon, but then close the box before they start lifting. Now we have a small box with a big balloon in it, right? And that's almost like, that's like the Rubik's Cube. That's like the challenge of people when it comes to lifting, is like, how do I get this? It's almost like that scene in Die Hard 3 where they're like, how do we get exactly 2 gallons into the tub to put it on the thing? It's like, okay, we obviously can't get 3 gallons in a 2-gallon container. Got it. And then they do the whole thing. That's the mental gymnastics that people go through when they're attempting to learn how to brace. It's like, how do I get a big balloon in a small box? It's like, well, you either build the balloon and make the box small around it, or you blow up the balloon in a small box. And that's really where the muscular component of bracing comes in. So a lot of people that end up in over breathing positions probably don't have the strength and musculature externally to maintain that smaller size of the box as they attempt to fill up that balloon.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
2 for 2. Core bracing, done. Mic drop, over. J to the ROC, Sunnyvale Trailer Park, what up?
I love it, man.
But I think that's it. Like, the respiratory component is as big a part of it as the muscular component, but they're both equally as big, right? The idea that, you can fix a brace by breathing or just by, or from muscular perspective is like maybe if someone doesn't have a core, the muscular perspective will make a difference. But it's like everyone's probably needs a heavy dose of both, right? And one of the things that we could superimpose over that hierarchy or that linear ascension that we made of like, okay, here we have direct and indirect, static and dynamic, thinking of like, okay, direct static being like the most remedial and indirect dynamic being the most progressed. It's like, how does breathing play a role in each one of those, right? Because like when I go through and I think direct static, I don't hold side planks for rep or for time. I hold them for breath.
Right.
Someone does a side plank. It's like, okay, we're laterally compressing the rib cage on this side, allowing for expansion on the other side. What can your diaphragm do with a rib cage in this position? So, and you'll see people get the fucking speed wobbles. When do you get them to get a deep inhale and they're like, psoas is kind of like, you know, resisting force of that lumbar spine, and they're trying to get that diaphragm to lower. It's like medial arcuate ligament is going to attach the psoas to the diaphragm, right? Or medial arcuate ligament is going to attach the psoas to the diaphragm. So they're trying to push that diaphragm down, and that psoas is not letting it go down, right? So it's like over weeks, the progression is never of time, although time is a byproduct of breaths. But I want them to be able to go through full excursion of inhalation and exhalation in the lowest tier of hierarchy of like, okay, we're doing direct static. If we can do that in 3 planes, side plank, curl up, bird dog, and I can get a full expansion as the diaphragm lowers in the rib cage, guess what the measured progression is then? Okay, great. We can go through full excursion of the diaphragm in direct static. Let's go to direct dynamic, right? You want to really fuck up your core and get like sick abs for the beach. Force an exhalation at the bottom of a rope crunch. Because what's the function of the rectus abdominis? It's like, yeah, it'll flex the lumbar spine, but it's also going to be an accessory muscle of exhalation or forced exhalation, right? So if I can get a stretch through like, you know, through the sagittal plane as I open up in a rope crunch and I can inhale, it's like, okay, that inhalation is going to drive a further wedge between my pelvis and my rib cage, get more of a stretch to that muscle. And then if I close down, if I go through a full exhalation, I can fully exhale in this crunch position and actually force my abs to assist in that process, right? So it's like, how is it then how do we make, again, expediency, or how do we build expediency in the process of learning core bracing? It's just like, well, we have this layout for you. If you just paint over proper breath cycle timing over these exercises, you're gonna be sweet. Like, what's one thing everyone does? Tennis, classic example. Tennis would be an indirect dynamic relationship at the core, right? Because
with
that
breathing.
trunk's spinning. There was a time where I liked watching tennis, but I couldn't have it on because I felt too awkward with my parents in the room. Like listening to Venus and Serena Williams with your parents. Try it. Just put on old like US Open and just wait watch how quickly people think you're watching porn in the living room.
Yeah, that's how I became a man.
Wait, watching porn in the living room?
Well, yeah.
Like, oh my God.
Tennis,
so
porn is all the
embarrassing.
same.
So embarrassing. Jay got caught watching tennis yesterday. Oh man, his mom walked in, caught him.
So pissed.
I don't usually watch tennis with a Kleenex box. But anyways, but what are they doing? They're expressing that forceful exhalation but what are they doing on the wind up? Yeah. Right? So it's just like, all right, how do we just superimpose breathing over this hierarchy of direct static, direct dynamic, indirect static, indirect dynamic?
I'm glad that we took it here because we dropped the mic too early. Now this is a complete mic drop. This is just stomp that fucking mic. There needs to be no more.
Yeah, and really, like, I think we've solved it. You don't need to listen to other podcasts, period. But you also don't need to listen to other podcasts about core bracing because that is a logical progression. I don't know if is there anything else you want to talk about? Do you want to talk about the weather? Because we're done with this entirely. Like, this is it. If you like this podcast, send it to your friends or people who don't know how to brace, or try and figure out where you're at on that continuum. And then just screenshot the thing and put it up on Instagram and all that at Red, White, and Jordan, at Lunderjack Productions, at the _muscle_doc, at pre_script. I don't know. We exist in a lot of places on the internet.
A lot of places.
But we appreciate you guys hanging out per usual.
Yeah.
Starting 2022 with a bang. So if we could get the Spotify numbers up this year, pad the stats, we'll do that. And we'll see you guys next week. Thanks for hanging out.
Thanks for letting me in your ears.
That's gonna be the new sign off. That's gonna be it.